It is December the 15th. The weary French troops stand on the ruins of the just conquered Fort Douaumont. This day is considered the last day of the Battle of Verdun. Welcome back to a new video, and in this video I'm gonna talk about the Battle of Verdun. The background to the battle lay in an attempt by the German army leadership to break through the stalled front in the west. The firepower of the guns was great enough for this purpose, but the mobility of the troops was far too low. Tanks and armored vehicles were not yet available, and infantrymen could not advance fast enough on foot and without armor over the broken terrain. The supreme machine gun, the then queen of the battlefield, made that impossible. German commander-in-chief Erich von Falkenhayn had therefore figured that only an empty bleeding tactic had a chance of success. He saw the place in the front line that the French would defend to the hilt. There he wanted to attack constantly and thus have the opportunity to wipe out the entire French army. He found that place in Verdun, a glorious fortified city that the French would never give up. There von Falkenhayn decided to launch the attack. The attack was preceded by murderous drum fire. The intention was that the lines would be so flattened by the shells that the German troops could take over the positions on foot. Large underground shelters were dug to keep entire units hidden until just before the battle. This would greatly increase the element of surprise in the attack. No long and from the air easily visible attack and supply trenches were then needed. Indeed, the French High Command remained ignorant of the impending danger for a long time. A local French commander, Lieutenant Colonel Émile Drian, tried in many ways to wake up the Supreme Command. He constantly pointed out the great risk faced on Verdun. It had hardly any effect. Only in February 1916, when the German attack was delayed only because of bad weather, did the French headquarters realize that something terrible was about to happen and decided to send additional reinforcements to Verdun. It was only barely in time. The German attack should have begun on February 12, 1916, but in reality it did not begin until February 21st. On February 21st at 7:15 am, German time was 1 hour later, 1,225 cannons broke out their fire over the French lines at the front of Verdun. The cannon fire was so intense that the underground rumbling and thundering could be heard and felt as far as 170 kilometers around Verdun. As far as Paris, the air trembled and the windows tinkled. French airmen who flew over Verdun during the bombardment told they had seen gigantic columns of flame and smoke and that the front looked like it was a smoking industrial city. This is consistent with the observation of General Pétain, who estimated that 1 million shells were fired on that first day alone. The bombardment lasted almost 5 hours a stretch, until noon. Then there was a brief break to entice the survivors to climb out of shelters to recover a bit from the horrors of the drum fire. They would then be destroyed after 10 minutes with an even heavier cannon fire. After the break, the bombardment continued until about 4:30 p.m. Thereupon, the infantry attack began. The German soldiers climbed out of their assault trenches and began to cross the broken terrain. For the first several hundred yards, nothing happened. The cannon fire had completely destroyed the first French lines, but things were different at the second defensive line. There did appear to be survivors, who fought ferociously. Beyond the fact that the bombardment killed, wounded or stunned many Frenchmen, it had filled the survivors with a rage and fury that made them fight till the last hilt. By the end of the first day, the Germans had gained about 2 kilometers of ground. Still they encountered more resistance than expected. Also losses were higher than originally thought, a very small omen of what was about to come. 2 battalions of light infantry, the 56th and 59th Battalion, the Chasseurs à pied, hunters on foot, and the Lieutenant Colonel Émile Drian were defending a small forest northeast of Verdun, called the Bois de Chareux, hazelnut forest. During the February 21st bombardment, more than 80,000 shells, 10,000 tons of explosive were fired at a piece of land no larger than 1 square kilometer. Understandably, little remained of the forest and most of the chasseurs. The handful of men who did survive the bombardment, however, emerged dazed and tried to mount a defense of the forest. Despite a 9-hour barrage, the French stubbornly defended every crater and trench. The Germans were surprised to find themselves still under machine gun fire, but quickly passed Drian's chasseurs on both flanks. The next morning, February 22nd, his men were surrounded on 3 sides. By the end of the day, the Germans had even infiltrated the woods behind the 2 battalions, and around 4:30 p.m. Drian ordered his remaining soldiers to retreat. As he left the first aid post, Drian was hit by shrapnel fragment and fell mortally wounded. His last words were reportedly, "Oh, la mon Dieu, oh there, my God." Of the 1,200 chasseurs, around 400 managed to reach the French positions near the village of Beaumont. However, the heroic defense of the Bois de Chelles had delayed the Germans for 24 hours and allowed the remaining French at Verdun to prepare for an attack. On the French side, however, panic reigned, both in the general headquarters at Chantilly and in the general staff of General Heer, in charge of the region fortifiée de Verdun. A new local commander was appointed, General Philippe Pétain. He was given the assignment that von Falkenhayn had foreseen. Pétain had to defend the right bank of the Meuse against the German attack at all cost. He established his headquarters in Soilly, the south of Verdun. On February 28, the thaw suddenly set in. The supply of troops and supplies to Verdun threatened to become hopelessly jammed. The main supply route from Bar-le-Duc to Verdun turned out to be one big mud puddle. Then Pétain gave his famous order. Territorial troops, an auxiliary corps of semi-military and veterans, were to throw crushed stones onto the road with shovels 24 hours a day, so that it could be jammed by the massive tires of the trucks. It had worked, day in and day out, from February 1916 to September 1916. The trucks drove off and on in 2 endless lines. It has been calculated that at the height of the battle, a vehicle passed by every 14 seconds, which works out to 250 trucks an hour. During the Battle of Verdun, a total of 2 million French soldiers were transported along this road, along with more than 1 million tons of ammunition, and for 400,000 men, the Voie Sacrée indeed became a sacrificial road. Meanwhile, things had gone considerably better for the Germans than for the French. After the fierce fighting had started on February 21st, German troops had moved across almost the entire front on the right side of the Meuse River to some 8 kilometers closer to Verdun. And on February 25th they could even begin to attack the largest and strongest fort in the defensive line around Verdun, Fort Douaumont. The Germans countered on losing thousands, perhaps even tens of thousands, of soldiers in the conquest, but history turned out to be differently. At the beginning of the war, the Germans had shattered the Belgian forts of Namur, Liège and Antwerp with their heavy mortars, big Burfas. Hence the French believed the fort had had their time. And the government decided during the war to dismantle all the forts. Therefore, at the time of the German attack, Douaumont was occupied by only 60 lightly armed, almost retired territorial soldiers who basically only carried out the maintenance of the building. Therefore, the capture of the fort by the German army was not accompanied by much violence. There are several stories circulating about exactly which German soldiers can take credit for the conquest. According to the most likely story, Lieutenant Eugène Radke and his men of the 6th Company of the 24th Brandenburg Regiments were the first to enter the fort. Pretty soon they were followed by Captain Haupt and his men. However, they did so not only out of heroism or mortal contempt, but mainly because they were seeking protection from German artillery fire, which was extremely poorly aimed. Radke and Haupt soon discovered that the fort was barely manned and absolutely in no state of defense. Thereupon they took control and reported Douaumont is gefallen. This made a deep impression on both the German and French people. In Germany, church bells were rung and children were given a day off from school. In France, people were in tears and considered the loss of the fortress a tragedy. And indeed it was, even though it had not been a shot fired in the entire conquest, the loss of Douaumont would cost the lives of thousands of French soldiers. It soon became clear to the Germans that they could not continue the attack on Verdun if they did not tackle the French fortifications on either side of the front in front of Verdun. The forts on the western bank of the Meuse continuously shelled attacking troops in the flank and caused great losses. The same occurred on the other side of the front at Fort Vaux. To attack the forts west of the Meuse, however, the Germans had to first control the ridge between Le Morthomme and Hill 304. On March 6, 1916, the Battle on the Wings began. Again, they began with a heavy bombardment of shell fire. Then came the massive infantry attacks. Barbaric hand-to-hand combat took place there. In summer, the horror of the heat was added to this. It was not until June that both hilltops were occupied by the Germans, and although they got a little further than that line, they were never able to capture the French forts. On the western bank of the Meuse, the German attacks ran aground in the dogged resistance of the French troops. Already in April 1916, Pétain launched his famous day order, "On les aura," "we will get them." On the other wing of the front they were somewhat successful, albeit at the cost of great losses. The target of all attacks in that front section was Fort Vaux. That fort was much smaller than Douaumont. However, as a result of the decommissioning decision, it no longer had a heavy gun, but it was still a fulcrum in the French line, reinforced with a series of trenches. The fighting that took place there in the spring and summer of 1916 caused many deaths. These simply remained laying around, because it was impossible to recover the bodies during the battle. On June 2nd, the final assault on the fort was launched. The German pioneers managed to get into the underground passages of the fort through the corner batteries. Terrible fighting took place there, in the darkness, with hand grenades, bayonets and flamethrowers. For 5 days, the French defenders under Major Raynal resisted by erecting barricades in the dark galleries. The 300 or so soldiers defending Fort Vaux suffered from the chlorine gas used by the Germans and the fire of the flamethrowers. Also the explosions of the 210mm shells that struck the structure and the dire lack of water. Men died horribly from suffocation and thirst. On the night of the 5th of June, Raynal sent a final carrier pigeon to the French High Command in Verdun, reporting that he could no longer hold the fort. After Raynal withdrew his 100 survivors, Fort Vaux fell on the morning of June 7, 1916. The bloody climax of the Battle of Verdun was at hand. The last attacks by the Germans came on July 11th. This attack was also preceded by a gigantic artillery bombardment. Then 40,000 infantrymen, as on June 23, 1916, began their advance towards Verdun, toiling over the broken battlefield, stumbling over the equipment and corpses of soldiers killed earlier. They almost succeeded in reaching Verdun. The German troops got as far as Fort Soufile and could see Verdun a few kilometers away. Then they were shot away by the fort's defenders. Some were captured, others fled, and the attack on Verdun was a definite failure. It should be mentioned beforehand that the British and French armies had launched a counterattack at the Somme on June 25, 1916, the Battle of the Somme. After the 11th of July 1916 attack, the Germans decided that enough was enough. In August, Falkenhayn ordered no more costly attacks to be launched against Verdun. In September 1916, the new German commander-in-chief Ludendorff allowed only defensive actions on the ground. Although fighting continued in August and September, the massive infantry battles were over. In October, the French decided to counterattack. It was thoroughly prepared. They managed to refine the coordination of artillery and infantry in such a way that the infantry could advance behind the creeping screens of the shells. This prevented the enemy from being warned of the coming attack by the artillery suddenly ceasing fire. On October 24, 1916, the time had come. Around 11:30 am, the French began the attack. The troops advanced toward Fort Douaumont, climbed the superstructure and penetrated the fort. Strangely enough, the fort proved to be almost empty again. In fact, a fire had broken out in the fort the day before, and the Germans feared that the fire would penetrate the ammunition dump. Consequently, they had evacuated the fort. For the second time, Fort Douaumont changed occupiers, almost without a shot being fired. Nevertheless, the fighting of the intervening months had cost the lives of hundreds of thousands. On November 2nd, Fort Vaux was recaptured. The final last attack was made on December 15, 1916 to Loufamont-Bessenfaux. This considered to be the official end of the Battle of Verdun. The front was now broadly back to its pre-February 1916 positions. Meanwhile, the French side, there had been as many as 62,000 dead, 101,000 missing and 215,000 wounded, many of them invalids. The German side, there had been a total of 100,000 dead, 277,000 wounded, so in total 263,000 dead and 492,000 wounded. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe, and hope to see you in the next video.